Hello, I'm Kathy DeForest, founder of the Vision Quilt. The Vision Quilt is a grassroots effort to mobilize people to prevent gun violence. Like the AIDS quilt, we believe we can move our country from fear to connection using art to create change. When people come together to make Vision Quilt panels, they are really sharing what's in their hearts, and they know they can inspire others. Each of us can ask our friends and neighbors and family to be part of the change. One conversation at a time, together, we can prevent gun violence. Join me now as we watch one of these conversations.
Hello. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm Claudia Alec, community producer at the Oregon Shakespeare Festival and our facilitator for our conversation with Vision Quilt. Now, we should call this a community conversation because that's our goal, to change the conversation and start a productive dialogue that you can use as a model in your own community. Our topic today, preventing gun violence. We've assembled a small group of people from our community to share their visions about preventing gun violence. We certainly realize it's a polarizing and emotionally charged topic. And our hope is that this conversation will provide some building blocks so that you can start your own conversations to find common ground and some solutions for your community. Not everyone here agrees. Some own guns, some would never touch guns, but we are all in agreement that it's important to talk about this in order to prevent gun violence. We want everyone here today to feel comfortable sharing their views and to feel safe doing so. So please, speak up, speak out, and be respectful. We need a diversity of voices, and we want to make sure everyone gets heard. So let's start by having our friends introduce themselves. Let's start with you, Sheriff Corey Falls.
Well, thank you, Claudia. Good afternoon. My name is Corey Falls. I'm the Sheriff of Jackson County. I'm here for a couple reasons. One is I was invited, and I think it's important to be responsive when these type of discussions come up. And two, I grew up around guns, and I've chosen a profession that carries guns and have been involved in that in the last almost 20 years. So thank you for having me.
Hi, my name is Claire Senchina, and I'm here today because the issue of gun violence entered my life in December of 2014 when my only child was killed. It was a senseless, random shooting, and so after that I started investigating more about our laws and about how these shootings happen and how guns are so accessible. So it's become something I've have devoted my life to now.
My name is Adrian. I'm an incoming senior over at North Medford High School. And I try to be social with everyone, so I know a lot of kids who have used guns in a negative manner, but also a lot of people who use it in a positive manner. So I have kind of like a background in the youth of how they use weapons.
Hi, my name is Phil Ortega. Thank you for having me. I work with the youth in our community. I work for Eagle Point School District. I'm an attendance and student service coordinator. And I believe that as an adult, I have social responsibility to understand what's happening in our community and how to improve a collective voice to stopping gun violence.
Thank you. We'd like to start with an overview. So we're going to share a graphic. Now in this graphic, it talks about U.S. gun violence. And it says nearly 109,000 people are shot every year, 33,000 people die, 76,000 survive gun injuries, and at least 3 people will die during this conversation. That source is from the Brady Center to Prevent Gun Violence. So my first question for my friends here is this. In your view, what is the gun violence problem in the United States? What is the problem we're trying to solve?
In my view, is guns are too accessible, and we're very cavalier about owning guns. Even our background checks are not universal, though most people believe that's true. It is not. There are a lot of big loopholes. And even people who own guns legally have become a bit cavalier about them being an instrument that is possibly fatal. And there's been a lot of unintentional shootings with toddlers. And there's been a lot of guns stolen from licensed owners. So I think the accessibility of guns in this country has kind of gone out of control.
I believe there's a lack of education about working with our youth. I think youth might have an interest in guns, and I believe as adults in our community we need to share some education about what guns are used for and how to keep them safe, what a gun safe might look like, sound like, what a trigger lock might look like, and have meaningful discussions with our youth to prevent senseless acts of gun violence.
I agree with the education part. There's so many dynamics when you're talking about gun violence that spread such a broad spectrum when it comes to education, when it comes to the political views, the Second Amendment rights, and historically how guns came to the United States and what people's legal authority is, and then what's your social responsibility. So there's a lot of different discussions when it comes to weapons that we have to discuss, and education is a big piece of that.
Yeah, I agree with both of these because I think education and accessibility are both two of the major factors. Because I know growing up, my family owned a weapon in the house, and we were just taught don't touch it. We weren't taught like exactly what it does or anything, and it was also really accessible because it was just in this bag in the closet. So I think just kind of showing people like how to take care of them and like the responsibility that comes with it.
I would love for us each to share a story. Because I'm realizing we don't know each other that well. Would you be kind enough to just share a story about how guns have intersected with your life, if that would be all right?
I can do that. I can start with that because I grew up with guns in the home, and from an early age, we had them in our house. And to me, it was around, the reason why we had guns in the house mostly was for hunting. And for me, it was time spent with my father. And it was more of the time spent with my father opposed to the actual gun. And that was something that brought me closer with him within our family. So I'd never, my view of guns wasn't about the gun, it was about the outing with a parent.
And I grew up in a city, and we didn't have guns in our household, and actually my 3 brothers were not allowed to have play guns. And I raised my son that way, that guns were not toys, and never allowed him to have a play gun. And I worked as a nurse practitioner, nurse and a nurse practitioner for many years in a trauma center. I worked in the urgent care, so I saw the ramifications of gun violence. It would, some cases would just stay with me for days and days of, young men coming in their wheelchair to get the supplies for their ostomy bag. At 20 years old, they're paralyzed, and I remember had one patient a father who lost his job, his family, everything, because he was caught as he was coming home from work and crossing the street, he was caught in gunfire. And those stayed with me, but, to a certain extent, you can't bring everything home. And my son never had guns. I didn't know of anyone who had been killed by a gun. And even though that was in my work environment, it wasn't something I really worried about. And then it happened to me. And since then, I've met many parents with my work, my volunteer work. I've met many parents throughout the country who have lost children, and people have lost parents or siblings to violence, gun shootings, to mass shootings, to suicide. and parents who have come from all spectrums, who are gun owners themselves, who come from conservative states or Republicans or Democrats or, you know, from all spectrums. And once you've had that personally touch you, and if you look into the laws in our country and who's been calling the shots with guns in our country, it really opens your eyes. And so it's a lot of us people who have been survivors of gun violence who are working to change the dialogue around guns. It isn't get rid of guns, it isn't get rid of the Second Amendment. There's a bit of a problem in this country. I think we can all admit if every week we're opening the newspaper, turning on TV, and there's been another shooting, and there's, you know, it destroys lives, it ripples out. It isn't just the person who's dead, it's the parent who never spends another day thinking about how their child is dead. It's the friends, it's the relatives, it's the coworkers. It ripples out, and I think there's a problem, and I think there isn't just one solution. I don't think changing our gun laws are going to change everything. Maybe they'll decrease gun violence by 10%, maybe 50%. You know, education is not going to change everything, but maybe it'll decrease it by. So I think there's a lot of, there's a lot of different ways people are affected by gun violence. There's a lot of different solutions, and one doesn't preclude another.
I want to return back to that original question I'd asked, because I'd love to hear, you know, how guns intersect with your own lives.
Sure.
Or gun violence specifically.
I grew up in a town in Southern California called La Habra, and I grew up with drive-by shootings as a kind of normal way of life. 4 of my friends died in high school from gun violence, from drive-bys, and so it was part of my upbringing. It was all around me. I never thought guns were the reason for the death. It was the animosity, the gang violent kind of tendencies that young people are part of. And so I grew up around a lot of just issues in Southern California. And then I joined the Marine Corps, and guns were all around us, going to overseas, to all the Al-Salim Kuwait during Desert Shield and the tail end of Desert Storm, and how weapons were used in a different way. So I believe in the Second Amendment. I support the Second Amendment and what it stands for, but I do believe that I have a moral conviction, a responsibility, a social duty to protect our youth and our community, and that I believe now education is really what I need to focus more of my time on, because it's very hard to change an adult's perspective, but an impressionable young mind that has an interest or a curiosity, I feel obligated to share some views and teach some social responsibility.
Well, me growing up with guns in the household, it wasn't exactly in a positive way. Because, I mean, it wasn't like, it didn't bring a lot of positivity into the household, because I kind of viewed it as a negative thing that we owned a weapon. But it's not that the weapon was there, it's just the way that my family used the weapon, because it was kind of over time, like, threats were kind of made with it, so it wasn't the best thing to own one for, I'd say, like, our situation. But I never, I saw it as a way to view a negative way of owning a weapon, because I have friends at school that always talk about how they went hunting with their parents and they had fun shooting. So it kind of just showed it showed me the 2 different sides of what owning a weapon can be. But I support owning a weapon all the way. I don't think it's in every case a negative thing.
I grew up in Montana, and I remember Rudy, old man, lived across the street. We'd do chores for him, and he taught me how to shoot a gun. We went out to the backyard. It was a BB gun. And he did it because he recognized that, you know, we were in Montana, and that's what he had done for his children. And he was doing me a favor, teaching me to shoot a gun. We went to the backyard, and he taught me how to sight it. And I was aiming at the target that he put on the fence when I moved the sight to shoot it at this apple on the crabapple tree. And I was having a good time too, because I was like, I bet I could get it. And he goes, oh, and he knocks it to the ground. He was so angry. He was so angry at me. And I recall just being like, what happened? You know, what just happened here? Why are you angry at me? And he said, do you see where you're pointing your gun? Because I lived across the street from a church. So while I had been pointing that sight at a crabapple, behind that crabapple was a church. So I'm so grateful that the first time I encountered a gun was also the first time I really came to understand that guns are weapons, guns can kill people, and just the act of aiming it is in many ways an act of violence. I was very appreciative of that. So I've heard a lot of different things. I think I would love for us to, actually I think I'm going to ask this question. Do you think change is necessary right now in the United States around the issue of gun violence?
Of course I do. Over 30,000 people a year are killed by a gun in this country. It's comparable more to a country at war. None of our peer countries have those types of statistics, and they have mental illness, and they have bad parenting, they have racism, they have the violent videos and TV programs, but they don't have the accessibility to guns. Like anyone at any time can obtain a gun. And so in this country, we're 25 times more likely to die by a gun than our peer countries.
So you're saying that if I lived in England or
Correct.
Japan, less likely?
Oh, 25
25%.
25 times less likely. So I think, it isn't all homicide, it's a lot of suicide by gun, and it's, when there's a gun in the house, someone is more likely to die from suicide, and suicide is often an impulsive act, just like homicide is often an impulsive act. My son, I believe, was killed in an impulsive act. He didn't know the person. I don't think they caught him. I don't think he even knew he had killed someone that night. He fired a few shots into a crowd. He bought the gun for $20 on the street. So with that many people, if we had a flu that was killing 30,000 people a year, we would start saying, okay, I think there's a problem here, we should investigate this and try to find solutions. I don't think there's ever a solution, there's solutions. Let's talk about it, let's investigate it.
I do think there's just violence in general that in this country that needs to be addressed, and that impacts different communities different ways. And those discussions need to take place in all our communities. I haven't seen in my law enforcement career where more restrictions and changes has stopped that criminal element. And I think there's a large piece of the criminal element that carries out the crimes, whether it's with a gun or with your hands or other weapons that are used to hurt people. And I just haven't seen or any new laws would stop some of the very poor things that have happened around our country. So I don't know what more changes. I like having the dialogue, and I think that's important. And I think changes need to come at this level, sitting around and talking and problem solving and talking about the issues. But what we decide in Jackson County could be a different response to what you see in different areas.
I do think we have a culture of violence in the United States. I believe that the adults need to set the example. I work with kids every day, and I think kids need that guidance. They need that structure. They need the conversation, and they need to be heard. So it might look like to answer your question, I think a marketing campaign, the discussions, at the moment when they're most critical, when young people ask for a conversation or are curious, is there a caring person in their life that can help them or guide them to find that solution, whatever it is for them? And so I really believe it's not so much that the gun laws need to be stricter. I think it needs to be a conversation where all adults model the behavior we expect in our community.
I agree with all these statements, and also what you said, how not every crime is like from a legal weapon. Like sometimes people find other ways of getting them. But one of the things that stood out to me is about a month ago I read an article about, I think he was around 14 or 15, a boy who went to a gun show and purchased a weapon, like just like that. And I think like, I mean, I believe in the Second Amendment, so I don't think we should like take away guns, but maybe if there's like a process behind buying a gun, like say like if you have a car, I mean, a lot of people die every year from car accidents, but we don't blame the cars because it's the people driving the cars. So I think if there's like a process behind owning a gun, maybe like stuff will change, like a mental evaluation or just showing that you can be responsible with it. Because the people that already own the guns are responsible, like most of them. But it's not, like I'm not blaming everyone because I'm just saying that like maybe if there was sort of a process, there'd be more of like people showing, hey, like we really need to worry about this.
Well, and I'm going to acknowledge that this is the first time we're having this conversation with each other, and it's a little bit of an experiment. We're trying to do an experiment to show other communities what they could do. And part of me goes, we shouldn't try to jump at the beginning of this conversation to suggesting solutions. I don't know what the solutions are. In fact, listening to you, I'm still groping to articulate what the real problem is. Because I've heard people are dying. I've heard lack of education. I've heard a lot of things. And you discussed a statistic, and I think we have a graphic for that statistic. It was, you said that like 30,000 people, men, women, children, were dying every year from a gun.
And hundreds of thousands injured.
So the American Medical Association is calling this a public health crisis. And I'm just curious, you had mentioned that you're a nurse practitioner. So what's your assessment, or what do you think of this assessment from the AMA? And has that influenced your view on guns, about guns?
I see it as a public health issue, and I think it should be studied. I think I have found out amazing things since my son was killed. I start researching and trying to make sense of why he was killed. And one thing I found out is that the CDC actually used to study gun violence. And it took me back in the early 90s, I was a nurse then, and discussing this at the clinic I worked at, they wrote a paper for the New England Journal of Medicine, which is, the medical journal, talking about gun violence and how much likely you would be to die of homicide or suicide if there was a gun in your house. And when that was published, the NRA came in and had an amendment written by a Republican congressperson called the Dickey Amendment, virtually prohibiting any more study of gun violence in this country, what are they afraid of? I'm not sure. And so for over 20 years, it hasn't been studied, and actually the congressperson who is Dickey, who is now retired, has come out and said that was his most regretful thing he has ever done in his career. So I'd like to use the analogy, that's what is so confusing to me when a lot of people started having cars. I mean, that wasn't the case 60 years ago or 100 years ago. There weren't that many cars in our country. But when every family started having cars, the deaths from car accidents were high. And the government came in and said, okay, we need to find ways to decrease this. So they developed seat belts, they developed airbags. None of that existed when I was a child. They're now developing sensors that if you get close to a car, it'll warn you. And they're developing all these things that won't eliminate car deaths, won't take away anyone's car, but you do have to register your car. You do have to pass a test to say you drive safely. And it has decreased the amount of car deaths. So why aren't we doing this with guns? That's my, why? I have my opinion. I think the gun manufacturers are making a lot of money from gun sales. Since Obama has been in office, gun sales have gone up. Every mass shooting, gun sales go up.
A lot of those, what you're talking about, a lot of those are in place. In Jackson County, or actually in Oregon, the sheriffs are the ones that approve concealed handgun license, and to get that you have to go through a process. You have to fill out an application. You go through a process where the sheriff has to sign it, and that comes with producing training documentation. There are background checks. The example you gave about the 14-year-old going to a gun show, I don't know about that, but if there are processes in place that should stop that right now, that we wouldn't have to add anything. If that happened, that's wrong. That has to be looked into. So if you are, go ahead.
Well, I have a silly question. I heard, and this story might be apocryphal, the director of the Japanese film Tempopo in Japan was murdered by the Yakuza, by a drive-by knifing. I recall this being an amazing story because I thought, who on earth, why would they all jump out of the car and then run? That seems crazy to me. But I live in the United States where you do a drive-by shooting. And in drive-by knifing, no one else gets hurt. So I asked somebody, how on earth is that possible? And then they talked to me how hard it is just to get your hands on a gun in Japan, which is why they would do a drive-by knifing instead. How difficult is it for somebody to get a gun in the United States? Because you've just talked about this example with the 14-year-old. I'm just curious, how hard is it really to get a gun?
I would like to speak to that because I think there are background checks, like you say, in some areas, but they're not universal. That was something I didn't know until I went exploring.
I don't know what that means.
Well, for
Universal.
example, if there's a gun show, if you are a gun seller, you need to do background checks. If you are a private seller, you can be right next door and you don't need to do background checks in the same gun show. Also, if you are a private seller online, you do not need to do background checks. There's all kinds of loopholes. There's the Charleston loophole. The man who went to buy a gun in Charleston who killed those people in the church would not have passed a background check. But it took you only have to wait 72 hours for the background check to come back, and then they have the leeway to decide whether to sell the gun or not. Well, his records were in other counties. After 72 hours, they didn't have the information, and so they used their judgment to sell him a gun, and then he killed those 9 people. So there are a lot of loopholes. There aren't enough. There are some great laws in some places, but they're not universal, and that's what I feel needs to be done, is close all the loopholes into buying a gun, because it really varies. And there's straw purchases that happen that needs to be tightened up. People who buy a gun for their friend cannot pass a background check. They knowingly go in and buy a gun, and sometimes their friend is with them to give to them because they can pass a background check. There's a lot of loopholes that need to be tightened up. I think it won't prevent all killings, but it'll prevent. I often think if 10% of killings can be prevented in a year, that's 3,000 mothers who don't have to live in the hell I live in.
There's different laws in different states, and there has been some changes in Oregon, and it may not be in California yet. There has been some changes in Oregon in terms of private person to private person sales that covers some of the background. One of the universal laws is there is a waiting period to buy handguns, and when we're talking about background checks, if I want to go in and buy a handgun, I have to fill out paperwork that goes to the ATF, and then there's a waiting period before I get that. And it's not the same. The waiting period is not as long for if you buy a rifle or a shotgun, which can be just as dangerous as a handgun. I understand that. But when you're talking about private sales, person to person, whether it's a gun show, I think those are some of the things that you're talking about, where there are some differences. There are some differences by state. There are some differences by jurisdictions on what is allowed and not to obtain a firearm. And I could see where those things could be discussed.
And tell me if I'm wrong about this. I feel like if I wanted to get my hands on a gun, I could do that rather easily and rather quickly, like maybe within a week. Is that true? I'm looking at my friends who own guns or who know about how our community works around this, because I'm guessing right now. What do you think? I don't know. Yeah? In a week?
Sooner.
Sooner?
Yeah,
Really?
24 hours?
3 hours.
No.
3 hours.
3 days, within
No.
3 days.
3 days. That still feels fast. 3 hours seems really fast. But 3 days, wow.
Wow, there's still private cells, and the criminal element, I think, is much different than if I'm running to somebody and say, I need a gun, I don't think that happens very often. But if I want to buy a hunting rifle or a shotgun, I could probably get that fairly quick, within a day or two, if you wanted to access something like that. But I do think that there's the criminal element, that criminals can get their hands on weapons, and I think that is something that needs to be addressed.
Well, I would love to. We have another graphic that talks about guns for self-defense, and I've heard this in this conversation before, where people say, oh, well, people have to have more guns, and the more guns there are, then people can defend themselves. So I'd love to talk about that, especially with somebody who knows more than I do. So the data from the American Journal of Public Health, it said people who own guns are 4 to 5 times more likely to be shot in an assault than those without a gun. Forgive me, I'm actually reading this for the first time. Some will certainly dispute these numbers, but please share your thoughts on guns for self-defense. Okay, and that was from the American Journal of Public Health. I would love to hear your thoughts on guns for self-defense, and I would actually love to hear the thoughts of everyone here as well.
I would never have a gun in my house, and I've been so angry sometimes. I could shoot someone. I mean, I think we all have that. I wouldn't want to have that temptation. I think it makes a really easy way to commit really fatal violence.
But
And
don't people need guns to defend themselves? Like if they're, defend themselves from animals if they live somewhere rural?
Possibly, from my perspective, I've been pretty fortunate to live in Jackson County in Medford for the last 16 years. I've never had a need to use a weapon for personal safety. And that's a blessing of living in our community. And that's why I think I chose to participate in today's panel. Because if we want to focus the direction where our community goes, then we need to be active participants in that direction. And so we're pretty fortunate to live in Jackson County, but I do have a weapon. I am a sport shooter, a recreational shooter. I have shown my children how to use a gun, how to properly care for a gun. And so I believe in that, and it's just recreational use.
In my opinion, I get asked this a lot, Sheriff, should I have a gun, these types of things, and I never want to get into the discussion of telling somebody, you need to do this to make yourself feel safer. I think that is a personal, individual decision. I think people should have the right to have guns as self-defense if that's what makes them feel safer. Claire, that would not make you feel safer.
No.
For some people, it might make them feel safer to have it, whether they've ever been a victim of a crime or not. And there's a scare. If you just the history of our country and the Second Amendment rights. Sometimes that just makes people feel comfortable that I can own this and I can possess this and I don't want it taken away, and that comfort level alone is enough for people. And there's some people that believe in that whether they have a gun or not. So I think it's an individual choice that I wouldn't want to tell somebody one way or the other to have it. It'll make some people feel safer, some it won't.
Well, I'm remembering this article I read It was after one of those horrible school shootings, and it was after someone had offered up the solution of give guns to all of the teachers. And the article was from the police perspective, talking about how difficult it is to shoot a gun, aim a gun, and hit the target successfully, especially when people are moving around and especially when you are full of adrenaline and emotions. So again, I'm actually trying to find out, is the room safer when there's more people with guns in it? Does that make it a safer room? Or can people defend themselves more successfully if there are more guns there?
Well, there's a lot of responsibility that comes with owning and carrying a gun. And sometimes that is overlooked. Some people will feel safer just they have it, but there's so much that goes more with that. Is you have to practice, you have to train. Is a room safer with a bunch of guns in the room or one gun in the room? If there's one gun in a situation, or if you're carrying a gun, you're always bringing a gun to a situation. So that's something that if a gun owner that wants to carry a gun, they have to have that responsibility that if I'm going to carry this, then I'm bringing a gun into a situation that may otherwise not be there. On the other hand, if there are guns in locations, that might deter people from showing up there if they know that there's going to be a location where there's guns. So.
I would like to ask an officer, I mean, how do you feel about if there is a shooting and other people are carrying guns and so they try to stop the shooting and then you arrive on the scene, how do you determine in a split second who's the bad guy, who's the good guy, who's...
That is an excellent question, and that is extremely difficult. And I think that comes with the training and the responsibility. If you're going to carry a weapon and choose to get involved in something, we even tell our deputies that if you're going to carry off duty, you need to have identification, you need to identify stuff. And we tell our deputies, be a good witness. The only thing you should get involved in off duty is if it's life-threatening and you need to save somebody's life. So I think, and I know the average citizen doesn't have maybe that same direction, but no, we can't always decide who's who in a situation like that.
Right, in a split second.
It's extremely difficult, yes.
Yeah, and it hasn't been shown to deter violence. I mean, in the recent shooting in Dallas, there was 20 open carry people who ran just like everyone else. And the police chief there said, we're doing our job, the government needs to do theirs. I'll have to say, going back to gun laws, California has great gun laws. We're kind of the leader in the country. But Nevada, our border state, Arizona, our border state, have some of the worst. And so guns cross the borders.
Well, you talked about your experience, Phil, and you talked about family members who'd been killed through gang violence. And I'm just curious, because I have some similar family experiences. I'm wondering, how did that influence your view of guns?
You know, I have a lot of empathy for people that have gone through violence in general. Gun violence is a conversation, so I'm going to focus this answer to that. I remember growing up that Gus was, a friend of mine, was killed outside my home, and he was shot. And his last words were, you know, call 911. Tell my mom I love her. I understand that the conversations need to happen. As a matter of fact, I chose a career to be proactive, to work with young people, because I really believe that we have a duty and a responsibility to encourage civility. And Corey Falls talks about the criminal element, and that the root cause of all of these issues might have been experiences or lack of guidance when emotions get heavy and impulsive behaviors occur. So I chose a career where I could help influence young people. To be proactive, in my understanding, is one of the best ways of helping young people deter from that criminal element. and communicating an issue when things get stressful, so that we can bring down that impulsivity that causes violence in general. I think is something that I really took to heart from that incident that I holding Gus at when I was young. When he died, I didn't want to be part of it, because I lived in a gang community. It was everywhere. We had to have 2 sets of books, set of books at home, set of books at school in the locker room, because you can't run or fight with books. Well, I choose to be in a situation where I could work with kids so that that doesn't happen here. And we need to practice what we want and expect our young people to follow, so that situations like yours don't happen. Can gun laws help? Potentially, but we have very strict drug laws, we have very strict homicide laws, and yet they still occur. And so I think that, I know you want to deter away from solutions, but for the last 16 years, I've been working with kids. I have a lack of patience now waiting for the solution to come. If all adults in Jackson County who believe in this issue have a meaningful conversation with young people about the responsibility of owning a gun, about the responsibility of communicating a need, that in itself is one of the most, I think, successful ways of preventing violence.
I actually was going to say, it's okay for us to start talking about solutions at this point in the conversation. I just didn't want to jump there. But you mentioned something, and I wanted, again, I'm going to look to my colleagues and my friends for clarity on this issue. You had mentioned that we have laws to prevent other kinds of violence, and then you had suggested that perhaps they weren't effective, and I was just curious about that, because I feel like I've heard that argument made before about gun laws, and I go, hey, here we are with people with different opinions, let's actually talk about it.
Sometimes they're impulsive. As strict as as laws might be, people's emotions sometimes take over and they become impulsive.
So I'm wondering, is your suggestion that we do not need gun laws, that gun laws wouldn't help?
Oh, I think that they could help. I think that it shouldn't be the only strategy in a conversation.
Mm-hmm.
I agree with that. There isn't one solution, but another analogy is when I was young, I'm sure when you were young, people drank and they drove. And no one ever, there was never a designated driver. There was never, I don't think people, if they got caught, I think they mostly got a slap on their wrist. And then someone started a movement, the Mothers Against Drunk Driving. And now it's a cultural shift. I think the laws have shifted, but it's also a cultural shift. Of course, people still drink and drive, but most people are conscious of it, and probably a lot less people do it, and has decreased deaths from that. And I think your solution is wonderful and it gets at the core, but what about the people who fall through the cracks of that solution? Should they have the accessibility of the guns? You know, the people with the criminal tendencies, should they have such easy accessibility? And I think laws don't change everything completely, but I think they increase the bar. And they've been studies that show in those states that have better gun laws and it's more difficult to get it, crime does go down. Suicides and homicides do go down. So it's just increasing the difficulty of getting an instrument that people use for all reasons, and those that are going to use it for illegal reasons may still find a way to access it, but it won't be so easy. And so deaths will decrease because of that.
Well, we've talked about a lot of different populations. At least I've heard us talking about people who use guns for fun, recreationally. We've talked about the military. We've talked about law enforcement. We've talked about criminal elements. And you had mentioned, Phil, that you were a gun owner. And I think we have another graphic that talks a little bit about guns in the household or something. And I'm just wondering, I'm just curious about how you just keep your guns, and how are they safely stored, and what are the things you communicate with people about? Because the graphic, it says, the presence of guns in the home increases an individual's risk of death by homicide by 90%. That's from the American Journal of Epidemiology, which sounds very legitimate to me. I didn't come up with these, but that sounds very legitimate to me. So I'm just asking, when you have that weapon in your house, how do you make sure it's safely stored, and what are you communicating to your kids about this?
Yeah, I have a personal responsibility to make sure my children understand the dangers of weapons, how to use it. But I also have a personal responsibility to make sure it's in a safe, make sure I have a trigger lock on it, so that these kinds of instances do not occur, especially not in my home. I take that responsibility. So do all people have that same understanding? In Adrian's situation here, it was in a bag in the closet.
Well, Adrian, do you want to talk about that?
Well, just mentioning how Phil's family is like lucky to have him, and a lot of other families that are similar throughout the nation, just having parents that show them the responsibilities and the safety behind a weapon. Because in my household, it was a different story, because it was just kept in a bag in the closet. It was just like, slap on the wrist, don't touch this. It was never really shown like what it can do.
Well, how did it affect your family?
So in my situation, and of course this is just like my situation, it created a lot of tension in the household. Because I mean, sometimes my family would get a little angry, triggered, and they bring it up in like threats to each other, and it wouldn't be like, it wasn't used in a positive way. The best way I could put it.
As a teenager, how can we help young people stay away from gun culture and potentially enticing gun culture? I'm going to share a quick little story. So, high school, one of my good friends invites me over to show me her handgun. Now, this is in Montana, and she's got her little handgun, and I think she was showing it to me because she thought I was black, and I would think that's cool. And I, of course, was horrified. I was so scared. And she took it out, and she showed it to me, and then she accidentally shot through the cupboard. She's a mother now, very responsible lady. And I just go, oh, I remember that she thought it was so cool, and she assumed I would think it was cool too, and she could have killed me. So I'm just wondering, what's your message to young people? What do you think young people need to do to stay away from this enticing gun culture?
I think spread the word, really, because as she mentioned about the drunk driving thing, we recently had a project at my school that her name was Ashley, and her senior project was based on bringing awareness to drunk driving. And they had a whole kind of show of what drunk driving does, and they had like kind of a simulation of a car accident. And it was all based around drunk driving, and like a lot of people got emotional, a lot of people saw the impact, and it really like kind of sent out a shock throughout the school. And not a lot of people are really safe about drunk driving. A lot of people even quit drinking at my school. And I think just like these similar things can apply to gun violence as well.
So we're getting towards the last section of this conversation, and I want to make sure we hear from everybody, and I also want to encourage you guys to talk to each other. Have any of your views changed at all as the result of our conversation? And it's okay if you're like, nope, start this conversation here, I'm still here. That's okay. But has anybody's views changed at all on any piece of what they think?
I can start with that. I can certainly sympathize with Claire. I can't empathize because I've not been in that situation. And my views have not changed just based on this discussion. I think it has to continue. I think these discussions have to continue. I think this is healthy, and I think it's good to sit down and discuss this when it comes to gun violence and the direction of what's happening in our country.
Well, I'll acknowledge this conversation has been very polite. You're all really smart people who have deep experiences, and you've been really kind to each other. But I haven't actually noticed a lot of arguing or disagreeing. I have to ask, did we avoid some places in this conversation that might have been hard Or did we really talk about the things we needed to talk about?
I think we did. It's gun violence, and you showed some clips today and some statistics that probably opened a lot of people's eyes. I don't think it's new that it's an issue. So I don't think it's new that there's a criminal element and people use guns, or there's suicide at the hands of weapons. So I don't know if there's a lot of things to disagree about. I mean, I think the one thing that you start disagreeing about is when you start talking about taking people's guns away. That might get into a more discussion when it comes to the Second Amendment and people's constitutional rights.
Well, let me ask, does anyone think people's guns should be taken away here in this conversation? Okay. Well, I'm going to go back to this question of have your views changed. I still want you to reflect on that, but I'd also love to hear what you guys think the next steps are. So let's go back to that first question. Has anybody's views changed? All right, friends. What do we think are the most effective paths to change?
I think we got to stop being on autopilot and get involved in the conversation. I think that this is very healthy and that it needs to happen a whole lot more in communities.
Mm.
I think just awareness, like these talks, because I mean, obviously just laws aren't going to change it. It's the awareness surrounding it, just showing like, having everyone's different stories of like ways that guns have affected their lives. Because just getting the word out there of like what it can do and how we can help in the situation.
I think for me, I've never liked guns. I never considered having one or felt comfortable around them. But that's kind of where it stopped for me. And so having this personal experience, I've spent a lot of time reading up and studying. And I was amazed. I thought I was a pretty well-informed person. I was amazed what I found out. And I would just, I don't have the energy or to have battles with people over this. I just, want to express what it has meant to me, gun violence, and encourage people to do their own research and not just take, sound bites off of TV and figure, that's the answer. I feel it's a process for me. My views haven't changed here, but it's a process for me. And part of the process is feeling for the kid. They caught the 21-year-old who killed my son, and I've seen him in court. And, I don't think he had a good upbringing. I've investigated him a bit on what I could find out. And I don't think he had a good education, and I don't think he had a good role model. And, but if he was so easily able to buy a gun for $20 on the street, he wouldn't have killed my son, and he wouldn't be spending his life in jail. So that's kind of...
I see next step as multifaceted. I think there's a lot of the gun violence we talked about today it's the criminal behavior, it's felonious acts against people, but it's also suicides and accidental. That has been encompassed in a lot of the things we talked about. I think you have to get in the root cause, because those three things can be drastically different root causes that start that. If it's suicide, is there a piece of mental health? Is there a piece of drugs and alcohol? There are other things that you need to look at the root cause. Is there an education piece starting at a young age with some of the accidents that occurred? Is there the criminal element that criminals are accessing these, or are there some loopholes that we need to look at? I mean, those are four distinctly different avenues when you talk about gun violence that you have to start slicing down and figuring out the root cause of all of those. And I think that's what's important to do. A blanket solution of one size fits all is not going to help each one of those situations, and it's not going to help the individual jurisdictions that are so drastically different across the United States, where a lot of gun violence will impact different communities in a different way.
Well, I think my own personal opinion about one thing we could do would be to take the example of Japan and make guns harder to get. I think I'm echoing your observations about the state of California, but also about the problem of its neighboring states and making those guns just that much easier to get to. Thank you, everyone, for taking part in this conversation, for taking part in this Vision Quilt conversation. Just starting the dialogue can make a real difference.